Hello, geometry students. Today's learning target is to talk about the properties of kites. So the definition of a kite is that we have two pairs of consecutive sides are congruent. Note that a kite is not a parallelogram. So what I mean by this is Ki and Ke are congruent. Also It and Et are congruent. And I'm going to show you a quick visual. So here we see a kite. If I were to make that kite bigger or smaller, notice the pairs of consecutive sides are congruent. And there's a couple properties of a parallelogram. I'm going to go down to the second figure here and remark those diagrams, or those tick marks. If I were to draw this diagonal, hopefully you can see the two triangles are congruent by side, 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 if I were to put the three tick marks. So since those triangles are congruent, angle I and angle E are congruent. So in the first property that I want to mark is that angle I and angle E are congruent. So let's write that in the box. One pair of opposite sides, one pair of opposite angles are congruent. Now let's learn another property regarding kites. So now I'm going to go down to the second diagram. I'm going to draw this other diagonal. And if you look at this picture, it looks like the diagonals are perpendicular. So let's take a visual look at that. So if you look at the kite on the screen, you can see that the diagonals are perpendicular. And I'm going to change the size of the kite. So notice the diagonals are always perpendicular. So the second property of a kite is the diagonals are perpendicular, and I'm going to draw my 90-degree angle in there. So the diagonals are perpendicular. This is similar to a rhombus. So now let's take a look at a third property of kites. In this third kite, I'm going to draw the blue diagonal. We know that Ki and Ke are congruent. That makes this an isosceles triangle. So these angles that I am marking are congruent. Likewise, It and Et are congruent, which makes these angles congruent because we have two isosceles triangles. And if I were to draw that other diagonal again, KT, we know that this is a right angle. And hopefully you can see that this yellow triangle is congruent to this green triangle. And because of that, it turns out, and I'm going to call this point A, where the diagonals intersect, that IA is congruent to AE. So one diagonal is bisected. And we'll take a look at a visual here. So if you look at this visual, you can see that the two blue segments with three tick marks are 5.3 and 5.3. Even if I change the shape, you'll notice that you have 4.6 and 4.6. And just for completeness, because the yellow and the green triangle are congruent, these angles that I'm marking in black are also congruent, angle ITA and angle ATE. On the other side, this pink triangle and this blue triangle are congruent. So from there we also know IKA, I'll put 3 tick marks, is congruent to AKE, I'll put 3 tick marks. So some people will say one pair of opposite angles are bisected. So these are the different properties of a kite. So just to summarize, 2 pairs of consecutive sides are congruent. 1 pair of opposite angles are congruent. The diagonals are always perpendicular. 1 diagonal is bisected. And 1 pair of opposite angles are also bisected.